Hi, everyone, and welcome. I am joined today by Colonel Douglas Macgregor, a former advisor to the Secretary of Defense. Welcome back on the program.
Yeah, happy to be with you, Glenn.
We spoke only a few weeks ago, yet, as things are these days, the world seems to have changed already. That is, the attacks on Russia's nuclear deterrence, its nuclear bombers. This is, of course, a very dramatic development. I thought a good place to start would be, well, to ask you, what do you think the wider consequences are of of this attack?
Well, we know that President Trump spoke with President Putin on the phone, and President Trump seems to have indicated that he was unaware of this attack on the Tupolev bombers who were sitting on the tarmac or the runway. And President Putin has a choice. He can believe him, in which case he decides that President Trump really is not in charge, doesn't know what's happening. And that's not an unreasonable assumption, as I'll try to explain. On the other hand, he decides that Trump is lying. Frankly, I'm afraid that I don't think Trump really was aware. This is not someone who follows the details carefully. And I recently learned that since he was inaugurated in January, he's had the sum total of 14 intelligence briefings. And in some cases, presidents have received an intelligence briefing every morning, first thing. In other cases, at least three times a week. So 14 is a relatively small number. So it's not impossible that he either waved this off as not terribly significant or didn't understand the strategic implications. That may well have been the case. Look, President Putin does not want a war with the United States or NATO. And if you look at the very deliberate, cautious, and predictable approach that he's taking, predictable insofar as everything is carefully planned, set up, and then executed, I think I think he understands that President Trump may not have known. So I think that's not impossible. I'm sure he's also disappointed because he understands something that President Trump obviously did not, that this has implications for the agreements reached under the strategic arms limitation talks. We park our bombers out in the open just as the Russians did for the same reasons. But having said that, I don't think we have to worry about an imminent nuclear exchange or war by any stretch of the imagination. I think we just have to come to terms with reality that President Trump was not that engaged on that particular issue. It's not a good thing, but I think that's what we have to assume.
But you still think that US and probably some European intelligence services were involved?
Oh, I think MI6 is very definitely involved, as is the Central Intelligence Agency and probably the Mossad. Those three are very carefully joined at the hip. The Mossad's been all over Ukraine from the very beginning. Uh, Zelensky visited Israel 10 or 12 times before the war broke out. That is a closely integrated effort, I think. So that's a fact of life. The issue really is not so much what are we going to do, but what are the Russians going to do at this point?
Um, how about the arms treaties, though? Because I spoke yesterday with Professor Marandi. He's an advisor to the Iranian nuclear team, and he made the point that that even their nuclear deal would be affected by this because if they have too much transparency, they could make themselves vulnerable. So assassination of a nuclear scientist to, attacks and all. Do you think this will have significant consequences on any arms treaties between the United States and Russia?
I think the Iranians have walked away from us. They recognize that whatever we say is probably not reliable. We simply can't be trusted. And they've referred openly to what they call the Bibi effect. If we really wanted an agreement with the Iranians, we could have had that a long, long time ago. And every time we come close to an agreement that involves some level of uranium enrichment, you have the Netanyahu phone call to Trump, or if not to Trump, then certainly to his minions in Washington. And it says this is unacceptable. We want nothing to do with it. I think Netanyahu very definitely wants a war with Iran. It's very obvious that President Trump does not want a war with Iran. And that's where we are right now. There's no real resolution of that conflict. Now, as far as it goes with the Russians, I don't think President Trump really understands the potential strategic implications. I think President Trump has been looking for some time now for a way to walk away from Ukraine. And I think he probably will. It's just tragic that he didn't do that instantly as soon as he was elected. Instead, he made these ridiculous boasts that he could end this on a phone call. He never understood the complexities of the conflict. He didn't understand its roots or its larger purpose. I don't think he understood what people in Washington were trying to do from the very beginning. People like Graham and Blumenthal and Schumer and Mitchell and others. They were engaged in a war with Russia. And of course, that's something that President Trump has never wanted. I don't think he wants it now. He certainly never wanted it in the past. The problem is that President Trump wants to be the anti-war president. The question is, he doesn't know how to do it. And he's not really in control. He's only partially in control. And again, when you push hard on President Trump, he has a bad habit of backing down. I witnessed that. He wanted to be out of Afghanistan in July of 2017. And he called in all the senior military officials, active and retired, along with a number of political advisors and members of his cabinet. In a room, there were perhaps 12 to 14 different people. He went around and said, well, what do you think? What do you think? What do you think? And he wanted out. And there were only two people of the 14. One was Steve Bannon. The other was Peter Navarro, who said, get out. Now's a great time to leave. It will never be any better. It's not going to get better. We need to get out. Everyone else said, oh, no, 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 we have to stay. What did he do? He caved. He caved. And that's the problem with President Trump. If he meets with what he perceives to be significant political resistance, then he backs down. That's the great danger. And that's what I worry most about every single day. That's what could get us involved in a war in the Middle East. It could involve us further in Ukraine in ways that we don't even want to consider, that would put us in a position of confrontation with Russia. And then, of course, you have the Chinese connection and virtually everybody else in the world that's opposed to what the Israelis are doing. So, these are facts of life that we have to deal with every day in Washington.
Well, the strikes on this nuclear bombers, it seems that the mood has shifted a bit in Moscow. To what extent do you think this will change Russian tactics on the battlefield? Or it does seem that restraint is now difficult, not just because of pressure from other politicians and the public that they have to act more forcefully, but also the sense of, I guess, the need to restore their deterrent. That is, well, if something like this happened in the United States, someone attacked their nuclear forces, one would think there's a need to revive this deterrent, send a signal that this will never happen again. But we have seen some changes. That is, Russia's hitting Ukrainian cities pretty hard now with drones and missiles. Is this a new tactic, you think, or is it just a temporary retaliation, or do you see any wider implications of how Russia would be changing its approach, given I guess, the anger that is now taking over?
I think it's important for everyone to realize, especially in Moscow, that strikes will not win the Ukraine war for Russia. I've looked at the target list. All the targets they picked to attack were legitimate. They all did severe damage, and they will have military impact on the ability of the Ukrainians to do very much. But it's not going to end the war. Now, in terms of the battlefield, the war is over. The Russians have won. But strategically, the war continues and will continue as long as Zelensky is there in Kiev with his little inner circle and they pretend to be a functional government with real institutions and real armed forces. And they will do that as long as we in Washington send them cash and military equipment. So the question is, what are you going to do about this, President Putin? Are you going to simply throw more rockets and missiles at the Ukrainians? That's not really going to change very much. You want an end to the war. I want an end to the war. President Trump always had a way to end the war. That is, cut off the military aid immediately. Withdraw all U.S. personnel, civilians, military, intelligence, doesn't matter, get them all out of Ukraine. Stop the flow of equipment as well as cash to Ukraine. At that point, the Ukrainian government and its operation collapses. The Europeans can't make up the difference. And the Europeans, regardless of what fools like Mr. Rutte and others say, they have no appetite for war. They're not interested in fighting for anything in Ukraine. They want to sit on the sidelines, posture as heroic defenders of this thing they call democracy, which is largely nonsense now in Western Europe. If you look at the censorship and the punishment meted out to people who have the audacity to disagree with whatever the mainstream opinion is uttered by the government, that's all nonsense. So the question is, if you're in Moscow, what are you going to do? I don't think they have much choice. I think that they've got to roll over the Dnieper River. They've got to cross it. They've got to go into Kiev and put this government out of business in Kiev. They've got to take Odessa because Odessa is the gateway for arms and all sorts of equipment and technology for Ukraine. Now they're going to send 10,000 Russian troops, I understand, to Moldova to protect the Russians who are living in Moldova. Well, if you're going to do that, you might as well take Odessa. Then you at least have a land bridge to Moldova. And I think that can be done. Once it becomes clear that the government in Kiev is out of business and Odessa is in Russian hands, I think at that point you're looking at an end state. Then you have a rump state Ukraine. Then the question is, what do the Romanians, the Moldovans, the Hungarians, the Slovaks, the Poles really do about it? Because they're the ones with a border with Russia and Ukraine. I don't know what the Lithuanians, Latvians, and Estonians are going to do except continue to sit on the sidelines and carp and complain like other Lilliputian countries with Lilliputian armies. It's just absurd. But I think the other states that I mentioned, they have an interest in ending this conflict as well. The question is, what do the rest do? The Germans? I mean, Germany is just a frightful mess. It's a catastrophe right now. You have a coalition governing there that can't agree on anything. You have people in power in Paris and London who might as well be on Mars. There's absolutely no grasp of reality whatsoever. So it's just appalling when I listen to what these people say. They're playing with fire, and they have no idea what that means. And what it means is very, very serious because at some point, the Russians are going to do what I just mentioned. They will because they don't have any choice. And if this doesn't end it, they'll have to do more. I think it was a member of the Russian delegation that said, well, remember, we fought Sweden for 21 years. They did. And we ought to remember that. And I think we ought to be interested in peace, not more conflict, because it's certainly not helping Ukraine. The principal victims in all of this are Ukrainians, let's face it. But I don't see any hope right now on the horizon for any rationality. Maybe we get some new governments, some new leadership in the West, we could see something positive happen. But right now, the Russians have to deal with the situation that exists. They've got to get rid of Zelensky and this horrible government he represents.
There is something awfully irrational about both governments and media at the moment. If you here in Europe make the argument that the Ukrainians are taking huge losses, much higher than the Russians, they will get very angry very quickly. And one has to ask why, given, this is quite evident that this is reality. But the fear is always the narrative that, well, if people believe that Ukrainians are taking high casualties, they might not support the war anymore. So this everything, yes, it's very obvious that this is about narrative control now. But you did
Well,
mention that the war. Sorry.
if you go back to Dunkirk and you look at the situation at the time, the Germans, for various reasons, were held back. And they were held back from going into Dunkirk, and that allowed the British Expeditionary Force, minus all of its equipment, to largely escape, along with a substantial number of French troops. If they had simply overrun Dunkirk at that point, the war would have ended. Churchill would have lost a no confidence vote. Britain would have sued for peace. Now that didn't happen. And so this little bit of small numbers, about 340,000 people get to England. And then they start running around with little armbands that say Dunkirk on them. And they're being greeted everywhere as heroes. And Churchill was furious. He said, "You don't win wars by making strategic withdrawals and retreats." He was furious. He said, this won't work. Well, I sort of see Western Europe in the same frame of mind. Sacrificing more than 1.5 million Ukrainian soldiers, God knows how many other civilians, along with reducing the nation state of Ukraine, if you really want to call it that, if it ever was, by driving millions of people out of the country, which is what has happened. That's not going to be a win or a victory for Europe. There are over 3 million Ukrainians in Poland alone, and the Poles are sick of them. There are millions of Ukrainians in Germany, and the Germans are sick of them. This is not an answer. This is not a solution. So the governments that are insisting that this is somehow or another wonderful, that Russia is losing, they're in for a rude awakening because eventually their populations will throw them out of office. And the Russians, if they have to, will ultimately roll right up to the border with Poland, which should not be anybody's desire or will. It certainly isn't the Russian goal. They don't want to do that. They don't want to be stuck with managing and governing crazy Western Ukrainians that hate Russians. You might as well just hang it up. You're going to have misery forever. They want these people to govern themselves. They just don't want them to be in NATO. They want them to be neutral. And they don't want them to pose a direct threat to Russia. That's it. We could organize that. We in the West, we could make that happen. But nobody wants to at the moment. But I think that will change over time.
What I was going to say before, though, is if Trump wanted to get rid of Zelensky, he had a real opportunity, though, after this attacks on the nuclear bombers. Or do you think this might be in the works that Washington is reconsidering? Because it's starting to seem more like a liability at this point in time. Again, not take him out necessarily, but let's say encourage him, fleeing to the French Riviera or, Miami or something.
Well, I understand why you would think that, but that presupposes that President Trump is in control. Who controls the Central Intelligence Agency? Who controls the flow of money and aid? Right now, it's not President Trump. It's the Congress, and I would argue undisclosed elements at the top of the Central Intelligence Agency, at the top of other intelligence agencies, MI6 and Mossad. So, we tend to look at the situation and assume that President Trump is like an emperor. And if he says, "Verily I say unto you, you will do the following," everybody marches in that direction. I don't see that right now. I don't think he is. He should be in charge, but I'm not confident that he is.
Well, I guess that's a good indication of, yeah, again, this attack on the Russian nuclear bombers. If he didn't know about it, yeah, certainly someone else, are behind the wheel.
Well, if he'd
Uh,
had a briefing and someone in the intelligence committee that was briefing him said, "Sir, the Ukrainians are planning the following," and it looks as though they've picked targets that include nuclear capable bombers in Siberia. And by the way, Mr. President, that has consequences for our agreements under the strategic arms limitation talks. Then I suspect he would have said, "Well, wait a minute, tell them not to do that." But that didn't happen.
well, it does seem that this escalation with nuclear bombers, it's not the only one, and the front lines, again, at least from my eyes, they appear to be crumbling. You're seeing some. Well, it's not recognized much in the Western media, but both the Ukrainians, Telegram channels as well as the Russians, they're there's more or less in consensus now that a disaster is currently unfolding. But given that front lines are crumbling, some NATO countries have a tendency to, well, I guess, respond with the threat or actual escalation. So, for example, the attack on Russia's nuclear forces, but also now the Germans talking about striking Russia with Taurus missiles and, similar irresponsible rhetoric. But NATO itself, though, has been severely weakened and over the past 3 years, while Russia has been strengthened. Indeed, we now see that a lot of its new equipment being developed is indeed being sent to the deep rear. So, you think it's possible with an actual direct NATO-Russia war? And is it, you think the NATO is wrong in assuming that they could win a conventional war? Because this is not Russia from 3 years ago. And as I said, NATO is not the NATO of three countries, sorry, of 3 years ago either, in terms of the internal cohesion. And also our weapons are all been sent and blown up in Ukraine.
Mhm. Glenn, I think NATO is an empty facade. It's been an empty facade for many, many years. And we were at 19 nations when I left SHAPE headquarters as the director of the Joint Operations Center for the Balkans. Today, how many are there? 32, 33, 34 nations? Well, it's absurd. It was herding cats in 1998 and 99 for missions in the Balkans that didn't involve any fighting. I mean, if you go back and look at the operations that we conducted in the Balkans, particularly the Kosovo Air Campaign, the only way to get European troops along with American troops in on the ground in the operation was to first bomb the Serbs, bomb their troops, bomb their forces, but most important, bomb what they couldn't protect, their energy infrastructure, transportation infrastructure, and so forth. Then the Russians made it clear at that point that they could not sustain Serbia through the winter. And the winter was coming. Remember, this is May of 1999, June, and they said, eventually the winter's going to get here. We don't have the fuel, we don't have the food. And so after 78 days, the Serbs agreed to withdraw their forces temporarily from Kosovo. They did not recognize the conquest of Kosovo by U.S. and allied forces as legitimate. They simply say, we can't stay, it can't be done. So they accepted the inevitable. Now, my point is, I was involved in putting that force together. I sat with the Deputy Supreme Commander Europe to put the so-called Kosovo force together. Very few people wanted to go. And then they had this, well, we can only afford to send a battalion. Well, can we combine our battalion with a brigade from Germany or a brigade from the United States or a brigade from Great Britain? Can we, in other words, everybody was looking to do something, at least symbolically, but in fact, materially, in a truly militarily impactful way, nothing. Come on, don't make me laugh. The situation today is worse. And now they have emptied their arsenals, whatever ammunition they had, whatever equipment they could send. They've sent. What have they got? Nothing. There is no unity of command inside NATO. You have one command and control structure. It's American. It's US. That's it. Europeans have never invested a dime in anything for themselves, which means if they go to war, then they fall in as poor cousins of the US military. Well, the US military doesn't have much to send, Glenn. The Army today is a shadow of its former self. What do we have? 430,000 people. They're stretched from Korea to Germany and across the Middle East and parts of Africa and some in Latin America. It's ridiculous. We've got nothing to send. So the notion that NATO could present much of a threat to Russia is a joke. What have the Russians got? Well, not only have they mobilized the country, and they have increased dramatically the numbers of troops that they have under arms. They have plans and measures in place to expand that even further. They have a manufacturing base that's running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to produce military equipment. So what are you going to do? Use a nuclear weapon? Well, that's sheer lunacy. If you do, you're going to end up with a smoking ruin that reaches from the Arctic Circle all the way down to southern Portugal. For what? It's absurd. The whole thing is the theater of the absurd. Bertolt Brecht or Dürrenmatt or any number of German speaking authors that wrote excellent plays about these sorts of facades would have a field day with this nonsense. This is all garbage. So it needs to stop, and people need to wake up. The average Norwegian, German, Dane, Dutchman, Frenchman needs to wake up. There's no interest in going over there. And here's the good news. The Russians have no interest in visiting Europe unless it is as a tourist or to do business.
Well, it's what you said. It does sound like the situation today as well. It seems like the less capabilities, the more they're beating their chests in terms of yeah, well, I guess faking it. But given this, I guess dark view of NATO, what is the NATO's current role then? What is the purpose and also its future relevance after this Ukraine debacle?
I wish you would go back and others would. And I was part of a discussion in January of 2022 at the Center for the National Interest. Dimitri Simes at the time was the principal monitor, but there are a number of Americans and Europeans involved in this. And I predicted that if this crisis, came to fruition, if the Russians intervened and we reacted as I anticipated we would, that NATO would not survive the crisis. It hasn't. This is a flimsy facade. There's nothing behind it. That's the problem. So, what is the mission? Well, the mission went out of the window in 1992 when it became clear that the Soviet state structure, this thing we called the Warsaw Pact, had all crumbled. And most of us at the time who were serving on the ground over there felt strongly that, really, we ought to get out of here. There's no purpose in having this large American military presence in Germany. The Germans need to get on with their lives, become a truly sovereign, independent nation again. We need to go home. Well, we all know what happened. They had to find a new mission for NATO. That's the famous, we're either out of area or out of business. In other words, we have to drag NATO members into places in the Middle East or Afghanistan or Africa or God knows where else, which is, of course, absurd. In other words, we have to repurpose it to keep it going. It's over. We can't afford it. Most Americans don't want it. If I were to stop the average American on the streets of Kansas City, Missouri, Portland, Oregon, and say, "What do you think about NATO?" I'll bet you that more than half would say, "What are you talking about? This is ridiculous." Europeans need to wake up. And President Trump has tried before, not always in the most eloquent way, but he's tried to make the point Europeans must be their own first responders. In other words, if there's a crisis that involves military power, you're going to have to defend yourselves initially. And the day of moving hundreds of thousands, let alone 1 million troops across the Atlantic, they're over. We'd never get there. Technology wouldn't permit it. All the troop carriers and aircraft carrying men and equipment would be shot out of the sky or sunk. We live in an age of precision guided technology. It's impossible. It wouldn't happen. So that means you've got to defend yourselves. And you can. There's no question about it. But the point is that there's no one that wants a war with you right now in Russia. That's just a lie. It's so tragic to listen to the otherwise intelligent and thoughtful leadership in Finland talk about preparing to fight the Russians. Good Lord Almighty. There's no interest in that. Surely they know that. They're creating an enemy that doesn't exist. And the danger is, as you know from history, if you keep insisting on the existence of a particular enemy, there's a good chance that eventually you'll be successful. It will emerge.
No, Finland is really a a tragedy. They were a great success story of a neutral country, but it did occur to me though in the late 90s we're on the wrong path. And I actually joined the army in 98. Also there still in 99 when NATO bombed Yugoslavia. And I at that time I remember some optimism that somehow Europe would unify or would move away from the bloc politics. Instead, we expanded and then within 2 weeks began bombing Yugoslavia. So that was yeah, rude awakening.
Well, when
But
you go back to that era, let me tell you something. The Italians, the Greeks, I think large numbers of the French, Spaniards, Portuguese, they were all horrified at what we were doing. You're bombing the Serbs to do what? Rescue Albanians? The Albanian organized crime state that spread all across Europe, that controlled prostitution from Stockholm all the way down to Sicily. I mean, people were horrified. I remember one I think it was the Italian defense minister, who said to a high-ranking NATO official, "Don't you understand? If you drive the Serbs out of Kosovo, we will become surrogate Serbs." In other words, we'll have to go in there and manage this disaster. There was no way, no one was listening. And the people who were most enthusiastic about intervening against the Serbs, they were in Norway.
I remember that.
Norway. Good Lord. Well, that's easy. You sit way up there in Norway, and if you're an Italian or a Greek, you say, well, the hell with you. You don't have to live with the consequences. We have to live with the consequences. This is why NATO is not going to survive. New structures will emerge. Countries will come together in the absence of this monstrosity called NATO. It will go away. And you will see new security arrangements, and they'll be based on what people think is real, not imaginary, and on cultural affinities. That's going to happen. So, to answer your question, NATO is finished. It's not dead man walking anymore. It's dead man standing still. Someone will have to come up and push it. It will fall over. That'll be the end of it.
Well, my last question though was about the what do you think is happening to our societies? Because we're not only, spent all our military equipment, but and exhausted our economies, but there's something quite ugly, I think, happening in society as well, which is this, we'll call it a descent into madness. Because 3 years ago there was still some caution, but now we had this gradual escalation, and with 3 years of continuously justifying any attacks, anything Zelensky would do. We had gone from this obligation to justify war. We're criminalizing diplomacy. And to be honest, I don't really recognize my society anymore. I don't really care for it much either, to be honest. And of course now peak crazy came with this attack on the Russian nuclear bombers. I would have liked to see some media and politicians, more or less wake up and say, wait, what are we doing here? Are we actually, going to, risk a nuclear war with the Russians? Are we attacking their nuclear deterrent? Instead, there was almost a uniform celebratory mood among the politicians and the media. Everyone was bending over backwards to just make sure that, explain that this was completely legitimate, and anyone who criticized it, should be met with deep suspicion and, check their bank accounts for rubles. This is uh, this is really pure madness, though. This is their nuclear deterrent we're attacking. I mean, well, how do you, I guess I explain this state of mind, what has shifted so much? Because they weren't like this 3 years ago.
Norway is in a unique position. Norway has a marvelous sovereign national wealth fund. Norway has recently discovered one of the largest deposits of rare earths anywhere in the world, but certainly in Europe. It also is finding lithium in great quantities, other minerals. So Norway is actually in a very strong position, economically at any rate. And one wonders why, under those circumstances, there is this sort of bellicosity that's developed, this unbridled hatred of Russians and everything Russian. I think people in Northern Europe in particular, I'll be frank with you, are far too ready to believe whatever their governments tell them. I've watched this over the years. People have asked me several times, well, the Germans are highly intelligent people. How could they have ever fallen for Hitler? Well, that's a different issue. There were a lot of damn good reasons why he came to power. But the point is that there was a willingness to believe in him until the bitter end in many cases. And the point is, at some point, don't you wake up and say, wait a minute, this was fine to this point, but now this is crazy? I don't see that happening very much in Europe in general, but particularly in Northern Europe, which disappoints me to no end. Uh, I think there's a larger state of mind that has lost sight of war and what war is really all about. War is not something you play at. War is not something that only happens on other people's soil. War is not something where only foreigners die and you do not. I talk to audiences of young men all the time that are aspiring to go to places like West Point. And they ask me, what should I do? What should I read? And I say, read this book. It's by Guy Serre, a Frenchman, and it's called The Forgotten Soldier. Read about it. He describes almost 3 years of service on the Eastern Front inside the Wehrmacht and what it was like. I said, if you want to understand what real warfare is like, if you want to know what's happening today in Ukraine, in Eastern Ukraine, read this book. And people don't do that. So they have these sort of false impressions. And the biggest false impression is that NATO is invulnerable, invincible, and superior in every way to everything else. It isn't. You know, and if there's one thing that the Russians have demonstrated is the seriousness with which they address military power and the security of their country. That should be taken very seriously in the West. It's not. And the West would do well to imitate the Russians and look at their own capabilities. Do they have a scientific industrial base that can manufacture the equipment that's required? Are they maintaining effective ground forces? All this little nonsense of little girls running around inside the armed forces in units that were formerly in any serious military environment purely men. That's a good example of stupidity and self-deception. Who are we kidding? If I look at the forces that we have in NATO today, and I include the United States, the discipline is appalling. It's weak. It won't stand up to fire. And that's the problem. The discipline in the Russian military is excellent. It's not perfect, but it's good. And they have built a very good force. We need to look at what we need to do to build effective forces. Otherwise, we are kidding ourselves and we are asking for disaster.
I do see a somewhat generational shift, though. The a bit older generation, the diplomats who will remember, well, the world before the unipolar moment, they seem to have some more recognition that it's good to consider the security concern of the opponent, that it's not a treasonous thing to do, and they seem to have more respect for the threat of war. I think the new politicians coming up the last 30 years, they treat this more or less as a video game. And as you said, something that happens in other countries, and we're shielded from it. But I agree with you. I think the future wars will come here as well. So, but
Well, I
people
hope
tend to learn the hard way.
I hope not.
Yeah.
But there has to be some sobriety. And right now, people are drunk on the illusion. And that illusion is that we are somehow are bigger, better, stronger, smarter. We're not. We need to come to terms with that reality, or we're in for a very, very harsh future.
Yeah. No, common sense is, or reason at least, is a key problem, I think, in this conflict. Yeah, Colonel Macgregor, as always, thank you so much for your time. I always appreciate it, and so do all the listeners. So thanks again.
Sure. Thank you, Glenn. Bye bye.